So hello and welcome to Centering Users, Developing a Community of Practice for User Experience and Archival Description, part of the virtual DLF Forum Sessions series this spring. My name is Aaliyah Reich, and I am Program Manager for Conferences and Events at CLIR and DLF, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's session. Before I invite each speaker to introduce themselves and we start the conversation, I'd like to remind attendees that we'll be following the Digital Library Federation Code of Conduct, which we'll place in the chat. Audience members, if you have a question for the speakers, please put those into the chat and feel free to chat with one another as well. We'll be turning to questions and answers at the 45-minute mark of this 60-minute session, and we'll take the last question at around 55 minutes past the hour. Speakers will now introduce themselves and we'll get going. So welcome to all.
I can start. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Hill, and I am a reference librarian at Houghton Library at Harvard University.
I can go. I'm Beth Cope. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the interim head of the manuscript section at Houghton Library at Harvard University. I do know where I work, I swear.
I can go next. I'm Alison Clemens. I'm the access strategist for special collections at Beinecke Library at Yale University, and I use she, her, or they, them pronouns.
And I'm Faith Charlton. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the lead processing archivist for Manuscripts Division Collections at Princeton University Library.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started with the presentation. All right, so before we begin, we'd just like to acknowledge and thank those who did the work to put this DLF Forum virtual session together. We'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us for our presentation. As a group, we'd like to state that we fully support archival repositories' equitable collaboration with Indigenous communities to ethically steward and describe collections created by or related to Indigenous people, as well as the reparation of Indigenous land and cultural heritage. So we're going to be organizing this session into two parts, starting with our presentation of about 30 minutes or so, and then we'd welcome spending the latter half of the session in conversation with all of you around user experience. So along with colleagues Krista Cleaton at Princeton and Jessica Tai at Yale, we were members of a working group of Stanford's Lighting the Way working meeting, a practitioner-focused strategic thinking opportunity intended to explore topics related to archival discovery and delivery in spring of 2021. We focused our time on a specific issue that we've not only come to speak about today, but to also see if and how you might want to be involved. Before addressing the issue, we want to acknowledge our positionality and privilege as white women who work at extremely well-resourced PWIs. While recognizing that there are complexities wrapped up in this fact, we hope our efforts in the area of user experience will create an opportunity for those in the profession to develop a diverse and inclusive community of practice. Our focus was the long-standing need to center and engage users in archival description through user experience initiatives. Much of what we're presenting today is included in a white paper we authored for the working meeting entitled A Call to Action, User Experience and Inclusive Description. Specifically, we feel that this work is necessary in order to better understand the impacts and ensure the appropriateness of the inclusive and reparative harm reduction description efforts in which archivists are increasingly engaging in an effort to benefit users, particularly those from historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. We think it's critical for archivists to build pathways for user engagement in inclusive description decisions and to embed user experience processes as part of routine practices and workflows. At the moment, we just don't have the data to understand the impact of the work we're doing, possibly hindering the potential and prioritization of such initiatives, or demonstrating that some of these efforts are unhelpful or in fact creating perpetual harm. We'd like to see the establishment of guidelines, best practices, and institutional and professional support for user and usability testing. We hope this would result in user-centered descriptive practices that are rooted in data rather than assumptions. We'd also like to create description that is responsive to and reflective of a wide variety of communities who create, are represented, and use historical records. There's not been a great deal of usability research done about archival description, and user experience testing that is done and written about in the field tends to focus solely on usability of finding aid sites or encoding of description, and these studies are not conducted routinely. On the other hand, there is a great deal of discourse around conscientious and reparative archival descriptive work. From a 2020-2021 survey that the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia's Anti-Racist Description Working Group sent out to the archival community about the anti-racist description resources they published in 2019, a majority of the 50 survey respondents noted that they or their institutions were beginning to engage in this work and that they had incorporated the resources into their descriptive workflows. Another informal poll at a session focusing on inclusive description during an RBMS 2021 conference demonstrated that of the 60 attendees, 55% were engaging in inclusive description work and 30% planned to do so. Proponents of inclusive description note the importance of community self-description, the need to equitably work with communities who created or who are documented in historical records, and the importance of privileging the language communities and individuals use to describe themselves. This entails collaborating with a wide variety of users to ensure that inclusive description work is in fact reflective of lived experiences, helpful and mitigating harm. Centering users in this way is a practice grounded in representational belonging, which empowers people who have been marginalized to have the autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect their presence in the archival record. This is often enacted by community archives, but traditional institutions should also participate in and prioritize these efforts. Over the past few years, institutions and professional organizations have made public statements regarding DEI initiatives, created committees, working groups, and have revised planning initiatives. Still, there's often a disconnect between institutions' stated support for DEI or social justice-related initiatives and what is actually implemented, prioritized, and routinized in practice, and the inroads that still need to be made, particularly the fact that library and archives professionals continue to be roughly 80% white. This interest in developing and supporting DEI initiatives has also spread across the professional community, and there have been new organizations that have formed, increasing archivists' awareness of and involvement in DEI work. I'll now pass it over to Bets.
The need to center users in descriptive practices is a complex, pervasive issue that extends beyond inclusive or reparative descriptive work. Centering user experience is an imperative of our field, and the need to implement this as a professional priority is underscored by considerations pertaining to inclusive and reparative work, generally speaking. Taking multiple aspects of this issue into account, we offer several recommendations for how institutions and archivists can address the need to center users in archival description. Next slide, please. The first of these relates to a community of practice. We advocate for building a professional community of practice so that usability work can be carried out in a way that is supported and informed by standards and guidelines. We specifically believe that the archival community would benefit from the establishment of a user experience section within the Society of American Archivists, or SAA, and we have actively pursued that. More on this in a moment, as it actually has been formed and is in its nascent stages. This community, no matter its governing structure, should develop a set of values and principles to guide user experience testing in archives, particularly testing related to descriptive content as well as design and functionality. These principles should be accompanied by a toolkit of scalable, customizable user and usability testing approaches and script templates. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation relates to individual implementation. Having standards of practice surrounding user testing will allow archivists to conduct this work at their institutions and serves as an advocacy tool for archivists pushing to prioritize this work at an institutional level. Archivists who are interested in or currently engaging in inclusive or reparative description should seek to learn and incorporate strategies and best practices from the user testing field, while also collaborating with user experience or UX colleagues, or those with UX experience to advocate for user testing and engagement models that are respectful, equitable, and relational rather than transactional. Importantly, as archivists, we should approach our work with an acknowledgement of our positions and experiences and normalize that we do not and will not know everything. We must instead allow other forms of expertise to inform our decision-making, particularly through community consultation and user testing. We must approach our work from a position of cultural humility. As we learned from our white paper co-author Jessica Tye's paper, Cultural Humility as a Framework for Anti-Oppressive Archival Description, quote, cultural humility prompts archivists to acknowledge that they will never have all the answers, therefore opening space for other voices and allowing non-traditional forms of expertise to inform decision-making, end quote. This mindset allows archivists to approach descriptive decision-making from a point not of knowing, but of open-minded inquisitiveness regarding other perspectives and experiences, especially those of users and communities. Next slide, please. Our third recommendation relates to institutional responsibility. The ability to routinely center users as part of descriptive work cannot happen without institutional support. Institutions should prioritize user testing and, similar to the individual level, approach this work from a position of cultural humility with self-reflection and self-critique. As Tai states in her paper, quote, cultural humility moves beyond the role of the individual, shifting responsibility to institutions to enact policy change, create public-facing documentation, and cultivate intentional shifts in organizational culture, end quote. Conducting inclusive, wide-ranging user and usability testing as part of regular archival practice, particularly testing related to reparative and inclusive descriptive practices, is another way an institution can adopt a position of cultural humility. For user testing to be conducted in a meaningful, sustainable way, there must be administrative buy-in and support. It is often the case that staff carrying out user experience testing at any given institution lack the necessary training and expertise to do so. Well-resourced institutions should ideally hire those with expertise in this area to dedicated positions or support staff training for those who lack such expertise. These institutions must provide staff with sufficient time to become fully trained and then offer both time and compensation to carry out testing. They should also support their membership in professional organizations that focus on UX work and engagement with the community of practice around user experience and archives. Users and consultants who are asked to participate in user experience testing should be recognized for their contributions, whether through financial compensation or explicit acknowledgement for providing their expertise and perspective. This recognition should be seen as a crucial part of personal and institutional relationship building. It is well known that institutions need to be significantly better in terms of hiring and retaining a diverse staff. However, it is important that institutions not overburden their Black, Indigenous, and people of color employees with DEI-specific or reparative work. Concerning descriptive work specifically, a balance must be struck between ensuring that there is a diverse set of perspectives from which description is being created and not automatically placing the responsibility for often difficult redescriptive or descriptive projects on BIPOC staff. Inclusive and reparative projects, which can include emotionally difficult labor, particularly by those who have experienced or been impacted by racism, bias, and prejudice, must be shared across staff. Institutions also have an ongoing practice of hiring contracted term archivists and other staff, including students, to carry out descriptive projects. This illustrates the current short-term interest in descriptive work and lack of commitment to considering this work an ongoing, permanently supported critical effort for libraries and archives. It is also necessary to welcome and ensure the inclusion of the perspective of a wide variety of users and communities engaged with and related to the materials we steward. This work must be grounded in the concept of representational belonging, with the hope to draw ties between inclusive description and the effective impact of community inclusion and representation. We hope that user experience work focused on archival description can spark meaningful relationship-based collaborations and experiences among users, library staff, and collections, and we hope that user experience work will serve as a catalyst and vehicle to share and distribute institutional power. Now I will turn it over to Faith to discuss our section proposal and goals for the brand new SAA user experience section, which developed directly out of our recommendations just described.
So as Bets mentioned, after the working meeting, our group decided to focus our efforts on creating an SAA section devoted to UX. To prepare to submit a proposal, we connected with Felicia Owens, SAA's former governance manager, who provided helpful information, including sharing recently submitted section proposals that inform the content of our submission. We also spoke with colleagues and SAA groups who graciously shared their time to discuss and provide feedback about their involvement in the process, or their potential interest in supporting the formation of this section. Next slide, please. The Archival and more broadly library community's interest in this effort was confirmed through a petition our group sent out to the community last fall, which reached the 100-member minimum for endorsement of a new SAA section within 12 hours of being circulated. By the time we submitted our proposal to SAA Council, the petition had over 200 positive votes. More than 150 respondents, both SAA and non-SAA members, said that they not only supported the effort, but would participate in the section if it were established. We also received positive feedback and formal support from the Accessibility and Disability Section Steering Committee. The comments and feedback that people shared through the petition, a few of which we included in this slide, were overwhelmingly positive. They spoke to the need of prioritizing this work and the lack of guidance for implementation. Next slide, please. Several respondents specifically said that the creation and existence of this section would prompt them to renew their SAA memberships or to be able to better make the case for their involvement in SAA. And I'll just pause briefly here so that folks can read this quote. Next slide, please. We included the petition feedback as part of our justification to SAA Council for the creation of a new section. In the proposal, we argued how the section would provide a professional space for a user experience community of practice, and among other deliverables, result in the development of standards and guidelines that would serve as a major step towards rectifying the lack of routine user experience testing. We noted how building a community of practice in this area would assure that usability work can be carried out in a way that is supported by peer-to-peer and professional organizational conversations and resources. A dedicated section would allow archivists from various backgrounds and with relevant experience to collaborate, learn, and better serve our many users. We envision the section's scope to encompass user experience as it relates to all aspects of archives, including description, discovery, and access. The section would assist in advocacy for user experience work in archives and could provide resources to assist with it, which, in addition to standards and guidelines, might include testing scripts, usability toolkits, and channels for professional communication. We argued how without professional standards, archivists continue to conduct their work in a silo, with many attempts to center users based only on our conceptions of researcher needs, and also noted how user testing typically focuses on select groups, most often made up of those who already hold systemic privilege within various institutions, particularly white academics. Next slide, please. We also argued that creating this section within SAA would ensure that there's space not only to discuss and create standards for user experience research, but to rethink how our archival description and our collections reach our users through various archival or discovery systems. Most importantly, the creation of this section would help ensure that users of archives have an opportunity to make their voices heard, making archival practices more equitable and inclusive. Next slide, please. We submitted our proposal to Council for review at their meeting last February, to which we were invited to attend. This is actually the only time during the year in which the body considers proposals for new sections. While some members raised concerns about creating new sections, as Council is currently in the midst of reviewing and assessing existing collections, the overwhelming evidence of support from the archival and library communities, paired with the fact that no other section focuses on this area or has the capacity to do so, resulted in Council approving the proposal. We've included a link in this slide and can add it to the chat as well for those interested in joining this section. As Beth mentioned, it is now officially formed and live on SAA's website, and we are organizing our first annual meeting for this summer. Next slide, please. In terms of deliverables for this section and building a community of practice, which we'd like to discuss with you all after our presentation, we're thinking members might begin by developing a set of shared values and principles to guide UX testing, and additionally testing and research methodologies that measure the impact of changes to descriptive content, interface design, and functionality, among others. We hope to create a toolkit of scalable, customizable user and usability testing approaches and script templates. These guidelines in the toolkit would provide an entry point for those conducting UX research as part of their practice. It could be maintained and supplemented as testing approaches develop and change over time, and include feedback from those who have used it in order to inform future testing decisions by archivists at repositories of various sizes, budgets, and audiences. The Archival community places a strong emphasis on shared standards, guidelines, and best practices. Creating such resources would give validity to UX work within our field and would allow archivists to ground this work in a larger interprofessional context, no matter the size or budget of the institution. We anticipate that the work of this section will benefit from close partnerships with existing SAA sections and governance bodies, including the Standards Committee and the Committee on Research, Data, and Assessment, or CORDA. It would also benefit from a potential partnership with the SAA Committee on Education and the SAA Education Department to develop instructional opportunities. We'd also like to develop connections with professional groups and organizations outside SAA, such as DLF's Assessment Interest Group. Next slide, please. Before we move on to the discussion portion of this section, we wanted to briefly talk about UX work that each of us is involved with at our own institutions. Next slide, please. So starting with Princeton, members of Princeton's Inclusive Description Working Group and the operations group that oversees the Finding Aids website have recently started working together on efforts to verify that the Inclusive Description Group's initiatives are in fact mitigating harm for users through usability and user experience testing. The Inclusive Description Working Group's primary goal is to tackle the complex issue of cultural sensitivity in archival description and to critically rethink our role as archivists in order to create description that is respectful to the individuals and communities who create, use, and are represented in the archival collections we manage. Thus far, we've engaged in multiple initiatives along these lines, including reparative description work, multilingual finding aids, content mediation, such as the use of content warnings and cover images, and feedback mechanisms to provide spaces for user engagement. User feedback mechanisms found on Princeton's Finding Aids site were included in usability testing conducted last year, which resulted in the creation of a report harmful language or content button. The button, which can be found on all pages of the website, direct users to a web form where they can submit information about offensive language and or digital or analog content they come across that is not appropriately contextualized. Last summer, members of the Inclusive Description Working Group consulted with Quinn Della Rosa and Kate Mitchell, Princeton's Archival Summer Fellows, who authored a paper on conducting user testing specifically for inclusive description. In addition to this paper, we're currently reviewing other relevant literature and are beginning to develop a methodology with an emphasis on a collaborative approach to testing that we hope to undertake within the next year. And I will pass it back to my colleagues.
All right, one example of user experience work being done at Harvard was a project that Bets and I completed when we looked at 5+ years of historical reference data from Houghton Library to get a better sense of the types of questions our users asked about finding aids. And I'll pass the rest to Bets.
Yeah, and so another thing that we've done was a usability study of archival description, which included 50 users, and they compared the usability of the description in 3 different finding aids at 3 different institutions, and each had a different level of processing and testing whether users were actually able to use more minimally described collections once having seen a more minimal finding aid. And we're also in an ongoing collaboration with the head of user experience at Harvard Library. We also do have a reparative archival description task force, which has been working across Harvard to identify and in a community of practice work through various terms that were deemed harmful or problematic in our archival description. And I will turn it over to Alison.
Thank you. So yes, at Yale, we also have a reparative archival description working group. We've done a few things that I would describe as user-focused, including a few redescription projects. And as part of that work, we've identified and drafted sort of boilerplate standardized notes that are openly available on our LibGuide documentation platform that we use. And then I'm also linking to just one of the instances of the notes in practice in the Sotota papers. So I have those in the chat now. And we've also done just a first initial round of user testing on harmful language reporting. So similar to what Faith described, we have a, it's actually named as suggest a correction, but we have a suggest a correction button in our finding platform archives at Yale. And so I've just included in this slide the script that we used to test to see whether users were able to find that feedback path, or what their sort of response was around being prompted to do so based on the script. So next slide, please. So now that we've talked about our own work, both sort of developing the community of practice in our own institutions, we really want to spend the rest of the time together, a little bit more than half of it, in open conversation with you all. So we have some initial questions that we thought that we could talk through either verbally or in the chat, whatever folks prefer. And please do, Aaliyah mentioned this at the top of the hour, but just please do keep in mind that this is being recorded if you have things that you want to share, but we hope that will not inhibit people. And then after we talk through those initial questions, we also thought that we would talk through some brainstorming questions focused on building the community of practice. So I think with that, we'll start off with the initial questions. And the first one is if folks have questions about our presentation. And I think I've seen at least a couple come through.
Yes, I can actually go ahead and read the ones that maybe from the beginning. There are a handful that have come through. So the first one is, some projects in the profession have been rooted in a so-called culture of assessment, such as the archival metrics toolkits and a census 1 and 2. How do you see the new SAA UX section interacting with these adjacent developments as they relate to assessment of archival programs and services in a broader sense?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer to it. It's something that we've talked through a little bit in our group, but I don't think that we've sort of formulated a strong sort of like collective opinion on it yet. I hope that's something that we can have an open discussion about in the section at large too. Yeah, I have some of my own thoughts, but I'll pause there to see if other folks want to chime in.
I would basically second what Alison said, and I think it's really open to the sort of the UX section at this point is sort of an open book. I think that's something to consider. And I think that having that conversation as a larger section, not amongst those of us that have sort of spearheaded its formation, will be really important. I do think that there's a lot of movement around a culture of assessment. And I think that part of that needs to involve more UX testing. And I think they're basically interrelated and sort of difficult to avoid seeing some interactions, but I think how we see those will develop over time.
Great. So we can move on to the next question. And I will say they are beginning to flow in. So if at any point you would like to transition to some of the other discussion activities that you've told me you are planning, just let me know and we can pause on the questions or pick them back up. But the second question is, has Princeton received any feedback via the reporting button? We have put a similar mechanism in place last year, but haven't gotten any responses.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have gotten feedback. I would say, so just to provide a little bit of context, we also have a suggest a correction button, and we were using that to solicit feedback from users for kind of more minor descriptive issues that they might come across, like incorrect spelling or the wrong date. And as we were discussing, trying to get feedback about harmful language or content, we initially included that in the suggest a correction form, with instructional explanation information. But it seemed like that kind of muddied the waters. And when we did some usability testing, it wasn't clear that that button was kind of all encompassing, which is why we decided to create specifically the report harmful language or content button. And I would say the feedback that we've received, both the suggest a correction and the report harmful language or content button, we often receive feedback from other staff. So other staff within special collections, like our public services colleagues, also other colleagues within the library. We haven't received, I would say, a significant, I feel like I don't have, sorry, statistics or anything in front of me. But I feel like we've received a small set of that sort of feedback. And I think something that we've been discussing, I think part of that is just trying to find the time, just trying to do outreach to let users know. We currently have a message on the landing page of the Finding Aid site that it's a little blurb about kind of, our activities in this area and how we would really encourage users to provide feedback about, this specifically. To have some sort of presence aside from the button on the Finding Aid site. And we have given some presentations related to this topic to our colleagues, but yeah, I think it's really more of an issue in terms of outreach and letting the, campus at large know that we're engaging in these efforts and that they're welcome to submit feedback. And we would really, like to have that interaction with users. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. This next one is a multi-parter, so I'll read it all. Yes.
Is it Simon's question?
I'm not sure. I'm working from another document.
Oh, okay. If it's someone that asks about people's own work, do you mind if we set that one aside for just a moment, since it's very similar to our second question?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this one is a question. I'll read it and let me know if you feel good or if we want to continue on. Okay. Besides centering users in descriptive work, what other areas of archival work should be areas of focus? And this is sort of directed to the chat, but also to the panelists. Is anyone currently working on improving some aspect of user experience at their institution? How is that going? And in what ways could colleagues at other institutions help? It seems fairly general.
Yeah, maybe let's answer the first one now, I guess ourselves, and then of course, please others answer in the chat, and then we'll come back to the second part since it's so similar to the second question that we've posed. Yeah, it's a big question. Even though I'm talking, I don't know, I don't feel like I should be the one person answering it. So maybe I'll pause there since I've been talking for a minute and let other folks chime in.
I'm a big fan of the idea that basically all aspects of archival work should have user testing. I think, the reason we talk about centering users quite so effectively is because of DAX actually says that is one of our priorities in its principles. And so our work has related to description, but I think that really relates across all aspects of the archival field. I don't think it's description limited. I think that was just sort of our approach to it from that white paper. But when it comes to like what aspects could be discussed and could be parts of a community of practice, I think that should be as broad as folks can imagine how to do user testing of various aspects of the experience of doing archival research.
Yeah, I would second that. And again, this is like Bets, I think you said, this is totally an open book, like something that is just getting started. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for discussion and kind of figuring out, the best approach or approaches. But yeah, I could envision the committee having, possibly multiple subcommittees or working groups that focus on specific areas. But I think it could be a wide range of archival work, like Bets noted.
Yeah, I hope that we'll also have the opportunity to think about web user experience more broadly, because it's pretty rare for someone to really be interacting like solely with our finding aids. They're usually finding and discovering them within environments, some of which we don't have any control over, but we can certainly be aware of how they're interfacing with our description. And then I think also we haven't talked about it in this group, but something that I think is really important is thinking about how users are experiencing our mediated spaces in our reading rooms. So I think that should be a key focus, certainly. So.
Great. Okay, let's look at some of these others. You may have addressed this a little bit, but do you see these recommendations and the larger UX section extending beyond finding aids and into digital collections platforms?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, definitely. That's something that we've talked about, and Faith mentioned during the presentation, but that's something that some of us have devoted a fair amount of attention to already, and I hope it's something that we'll talk about in the section too.
Great. Let's see, another one. There are many questions, many good ones coming in, so just wading through them. Will this group be releasing information or best practices that smaller organizations might be able to incorporate without having the means to conduct their own large-scale UX testing?
Yeah, I would say that is definitely a goal, and something that we've talked about from the outset is having guidelines and toolkits, resources, what have you, that are scalable and take into account, a variety of institutions, given their resources and staff, and audiences. So yeah, that would definitely be a goal.
Yeah, I think we're also hoping it's a place where people will share their templates, their scripts, things like that, so that any information that we can all share as a community can be used by anyone, and that can be pretty scalable too.
Great. Well, we have a handful more, so I will keep going unless you would like to move on to something else. Okay, great. Okay, can you talk more about your experiences working with people and departments dealing specifically in UX work? I'm curious how initiatives specific to archival research are balanced with other user experience projects that they may be working on.
So I can speak to this one a little bit. So basically, we can bring projects to our UX office, and even the things that we're doing. So when I did the usability study in 2019, 2020, that was something I brought to UX, and because it wasn't going to be making any changes to anything actually in the site to do it, they just assisted me with the sort of process of developing scripts and carrying out the work. When it comes to actually doing things that are user testing our active sites, those are things we need to do in collaboration with our UX team. And so we bring those to them, and then we see if they have the time and the opportunity. Sometimes they don't. And we've also been working pretty closely to start gaining some more statistics and a better understanding of how our users are just interacting with our site, and particularly how they get, say, from one aspect of our catalog over to the finding aid site, things like that. But yeah, it's a collaborative effort, and sometimes we are not necessarily the #1 priority on the list for this work.
Yeah, I'll say that our experience at Yale has been very similar. We're so fortunate to have user experience experts at the library, but even in a context as large as ours, it's a really small department, and they're managing a lot across the library. So again, it's a real privilege to be able to have that. But even in that case, they've been really helpful about trying to empower us and train us to do some of the work ourselves too. Which I think can really, there are a lot of questions in the chat about scale and resources. So I think it's really the case that you don't have to have a tremendously fleshed out program to get valuable insight. It is useful to have some knowledge and background in terms of thinking about how to structure scripts and feedback experiences, and obviously be respectful of the people that you're working with too. But yeah, it shouldn't be a space where it feels like the perfect is the enemy of the good. So that's part of what sort of prompted us to try to form this community of practice.
And I guess just quickly to talk about Princeton's environment a bit. So the library recently hired a UX librarian, which is great. And they very quickly started building a small team now, which is even better. The usability testing and some of the testing that I've been involved with, it's mostly been a small group of staff from special collections and also a member of our IT staff who has user experience expertise. So that was very helpful. But yeah, hopefully moving forward, we'll be able to collaborate with the UX team in the library more broadly. We've already had some initial conversations with them, so hopefully that'll be a collaboration moving forward.
Great. And so that last question sort of focused on cross departments at your own institutions, but there's another question about working outside with other iSchools or similar institutions in the future. Curious about if the group is plan on working closely with faculty at different schools or institutions, listing a number of possible, folks at other places who are advocates for user experience. So it seems like there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration and growth. So curious if you can speak to that.
We have not yet done any sort of outreach or work with faculty at any of the iSchools, but I think, again, the section itself is a really open book, and I think that relationship could be really helpful and fruitful. And I think that, yes, especially if there's any faculty in the room and you'd like to chat with us about the section, please do. I think I actually teach at Simmons sometimes, and I think there is more of an emphasis now on UX as part of your archival training than there was when I was there as a student. But I think getting students involved with the section too would also be really important.
Great. And there's one more that I see, and hopefully I haven't missed anything. But the last one that I'm seeing is the idea of creating shared templates and protocols for UX interviews and usability testing is so compelling. Has there been any conversation around including institutional review boards in this process?
Not to sound like a broken record, but we have not discussed that yet specifically, but it sounds like a good idea. And yes, definitely would be open to that. Sorry, go ahead, Beth.
Oh no, I was just going to say, it does occur to me, like that was one of the things that when I did my usability study, I was like, oh, I have to go through the IRB now. And I do think having like guidance on what to sort of expect from that experience would be helpful. But yeah, had not thought of that just yet. So that's really helpful.
I will say a couple more did pop in, but I also want to remind folks that, part of what the DLF Forum is about as an event that happens, that this is connected to, is about having these kinds of conversations and generating these sorts of ideas. So it's wonderful to see that, these kinds of conversations are leading to new ideas for this work. So that's sort of what it's all about, which is fantastic. So yes, there are a couple more questions that I will go to if you all are comfortable with that. Okay, great. Let's see. Yes.
Do you mind, just looking at the time, would you mind maybe going back to Simon's, which was the two-part question that started beside centering users and descriptive work, what other areas? And then is anyone currently working on improving some aspect of user experience at their institution?
Yes. Is that the one you'd like to answer? Or is there another one?
So yeah, it's really similar to the second question that we had. So I think it would be great to move into that, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah. You had covered it. Basically, I can repeat.
Sure.
Yeah, I can repeat. So besides centering users in descriptive work, what other areas of archival work should be areas of focus? Is anyone currently working on improving some aspect of user experience at their institution? How's that going? This is the question. And what ways could colleagues at other institutions help you? This is the one. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that'll be great because we would love to hear from people here too. So hopefully that'll serve to sort of open up the conversation more broadly too. Yeah, so please, if folks have related efforts that they would like to share, we would love to hear them. You're welcome to put them in the chat or to unmute or raise your hand and share them verbally too. We know that we can't be the only people doing this work, so we would love to learn what you've been up to. And if there are none, we can also move into a related question, which we have a couple of questions that we wanted to talk through in sort of a more like brainstorming fashion. And I see that there's a question in the chat asking if anyone in the South has been working on something like this. So I hope that for those who are in that region, that you might consider answering that in the chat if you have. But yeah, we have a couple of questions that we thought we would do via poll everywhere brainstorming. So let me just grab those questions. And I'm going to put them in the chat, and then I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what comes in. And the hope is that this will just let people participate more broadly in the discussion, so that you can just like type things into the response and not feel like you're having to unmute and talk to a big group of people, although that is also welcome. So I'm going to just share my screen, and I hope that people would be willing to answer these questions. I'm just going to test this link with one of my colleagues really quick. Bets, does that link get you to a response portal, if you don't mind taking a look while I just pull this up?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. It was formatted a little bit differently than I had anticipated, so I just wanted to double check before putting it out for everyone. So yeah, I hope folks might be willing to just share a little bit about you know, what would be useful in terms of developing this community of practice for you, what initial steps, what support, et cetera. Like any ideas are welcome. And I hope that you can see the screen over here. Is that right? Okay, good. Yeah, so the questions again are, what support would you like to see for a UX community of practice? What initial steps would be useful in forming that community and providing that support? And then, oh, wow, what do you want to be able to do in this area, and what do you need from a community to be able to do that? And as folks are entering things into Poll Everywhere, we can also have a conversation verbally or in chat too. Yeah, I'm seeing Jessica says, I would love to see a place for people to share their user testing results in an informal way. And Simon has a follow-up question. Thank you, Simon. It sounds like there's an interest in opportunities for regional connection too, which is great. Yeah, examples, design. Yeah, I like the focus on informality too. This can definitely be an intimidating space, so that's part of why we wanted to try to form something that you know, felt like a community that was accessible to people sort of at all levels of experience. And to be clear, you know, none of us are user experience professionals. We're archivists sort of trying to do this work. So yeah, we have a direct interest ourselves too. Faith, would you be willing to talk a little bit about education and instructional opportunities? I see you have something in the chat.
Sure, yeah, there was Nix had asked a question about beyond collaborating with libraries and library schools, are there any certificate or professional development programs that stand out as opportunities to learn more about UX for those already who have their MLIS? And I mentioned that one of the things that we had started talking about, you know, is in terms of the potential partnerships that this section could develop with other sections and committees in SAA. One thing we were thinking is, you know, partnering with SAA's Committee on Education and Education Development to develop instructional opportunities for professionals. So something like a certificate program, you know, could be a result of that. But yeah, I think the idea is to definitely have discussions with those groups about different opportunities that SAA could provide to its members.
Thank you. I'm looking at the results coming in and I'm scrolling back up in the chat too, because I think I missed some things as I was sharing my screen, and I see that there are some nice examples of people sharing work that they've been doing in this area. So I would encourage you to poke through there. I'll highlight, Corey says they did some user interviews and UX work when designing their finding aid website a few years ago, and hope to do that again in implementing a new finding aid website framework. And Barb says the University of Oklahoma Libraries, they've had a metadata justice working group with some good outcomes, currently doing a libraries wide inclusive metadata review with the task force, which is great. And then Jessica is mentioning some website usability testing as part of the American Congress Digital Archives Portal project, focused on searchability and website structure, which I think is really great, which is, obviously more general than description, but really important. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I see Simon has a question in the chat as well, and I think we do have time for it. So just gonna read it if you don't mind. Okay. It seems like publications created by archivists, which are aimed at the general public, assume that they are potential donors or specifically genealogical researchers. Are there any resources that address the general public as all potential researchers, a basic introduction to what archives are and how to do archival research and how to find relevant archives or collections? Does this already exist? And I think this is a UX concern because archives are so confusing for novice researchers. That's a great question. I've looked for this a little bit, and I will say that the thing that I turn to pretty often is a resource that was created by one of my colleagues here and Dorothy Berry at Harvard. If you might be willing to talk a little bit about that, Bets, it's the What is an Archive, What is a Finding Aid?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. I'm quite honored, to be honest. So back in 2020, Dorothy Berry and I created a Scalar site, which I will link once I'm done talking, because I'm not good at doing two things at once. Where we sort of divided up the work. She was our digital collections programs manager at Houghton Library at the time, and we were meeting with various undergrads virtually during the pandemic, and we wanted to provide a resource that would really sort of introduce people to both the sort of regular aspects of archives, like what's a finding aid, what are you going to find in a finding aid, how is it going to be organized, but also the sort of more problematic aspects of archival description, archival neutrality, archival silences, what might be missing from our description. And so we put together a site that sort of approaches all of that information in one place. And that's actually been also integrated into a Harvard-wide program that introduces undergrads to research more generally. And that has been an in-person program that's just used that website as a basis, but we are working on a digital version. So I'm also going to hunt up that site, because it's an overall Harvard Library program, so that it also introduces you to how to search in a catalog, but it does have a specific finding aid and handling components. So our preservation staff also has added a module that's about what you might expect when you walk into an archives, what kinds of things you might encounter in folders, what kind of boxes, how to handle a rare book, things like that. And so we're integrating that into a larger realm as well. But the Scalar site's really easy and very specific to archives. So I will get a couple of links as I can.
Thank you, and other folks might have resources too, but I really like what you and Dorothy created, Bets, so I turn to it pretty often to share with people.
And we have time for I don't see any additional questions at this point, but we have just a couple more minutes before we need to wrap up. So if there are any final thoughts from anyone, feel free.
I'll just mention, it's great to see your responses aggregated in this way. And on the back end, it says it's full. Oh, wow, we got a lot, I guess. I didn't even realize it had a cap, honestly. I wasn't expecting us to run up against it. But in addition to what you're seeing in the word cloud, it'll also give us like a list of your actual text of your response too, which we'll use to just for our consideration as we sort of work on section planning. Stop sharing. And then should we shout out the fact that we're having our first section meeting for folks who are SAA members, if you'd like to join us? I don't have my calendar up, but I can pull it up and get the precise date for that.
Yeah, I don't think we've sent an email out about that yet. I'll just quickly note too, just in the chat, there's a little bit of a back and forth, but just another kind of another resource that we've discussed that the section could hopefully provide as a bibliography, you know, as folks are doing this research and contributing to the discourse within our field in particular and other related fields outside of libraries and archives. And, you know, hopefully that would be like a living document that folks could contribute to. But I think that would be really helpful.
Excellent. Well, let's go ahead and formally wrap up. So thanks so much to our presenters and to everyone participating in the chat for a really stimulating session. We'll be sharing the recording for this session on our YouTube account in the coming weeks, so look out for that. We do have 3 more of these sessions, these DLF virtual sessions. One is coming up tomorrow, and there are 2 next week, one each on Thursday and Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern time, so same time as this. So please join us for those if you are available. And as a reminder, our calls for proposals for our in-person events in St. Louis this November are all open through May 1st. So Jennifer has just linked to the calls for proposals in the chat there. So please consider submitting and joining us in St. Louis. And with that, thank you all so much for attending and for presenting and for discussing and participating, and have a wonderful rest of your day.